Representation and slavery were issues that were intertwined from the very beginning. You had folks in the North who would have preferred that slaves not count at all, which would have led to what some would consider to be an overrepresentation of the North in Congress. And you had folks in the South who were slave owners who wanted slaves to count just as free folks counted, just as free people counted. That would have led to what some folks would argue would be the overrepresentation of the South in Congress. Instead, not surprisingly, we got a compromise. Slaves count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation. The 3/5 clause under the Constitution essentially allowed 5 slaves to count for 3 free people for purposes of representation. And as a consequence, the South got some bit of a bump up because of their slaves, but didn't get the full bump up that would have been what we would consider to be the 5/5 clause, or a 5/5 clause, which counted a slave as equal to a free person for representation purposes.
And so without defending it, I will attempt to clarify that it didn't mean that an African American was 3/5 of a white person. That's how it's often understood today. Actually, what it was simply a compromise, and it was a compromise over the issue of representation in Congress, and it was a compromise over representation for terms of direct taxation. Northern delegates did not think that Southern delegates should get credit for their slaves when it came to representation in Congress. After all, they couldn't vote. They were considered property. Southern delegates, of course, wanted such representation, but conversely, they did not want to be taxed on the basis of their slaves, whereas the Northern delegates thought that was a fine idea. How do we resolve these things? Well, with arbitrary numbers.
It probably sounds harsh to talk about slavery as a political compromise in the Constitution, but I think it's accurate. And we must take these men who sat in that building in Philadelphia, must take them as they were. We must understand where they were coming from and take them with their values and their flaws. The slave trade is the way the South was able to buy and sell labor in order to keep plantations and the economy afloat. It was the worst part of slavery. It was the most inhumane part of slavery, but all of slavery was an abomination. One of the issues at the convention was, what do we do about it? And in the end, a compromise was reached that placed a limit on the future of the slave trade. Another 20 years, as I recall, 1808, in the language of the Constitution, the slave trade had to stop. Compromise, I'm sure there were some who wanted the slave trade to continue indefinitely. There were others who probably thought there was some advantage to limiting it. By that time, I think the general consensus was there would be enough of a population of slaves in the states that the need for importation was not necessary.
One of the things slaves do is try to get out of slavery. They run away, and everybody knew that at the convention. So the Southern delegates insisted on a fugitive slave clause. There was a precedent in the Northwest Ordinance for the states of Ohio and to the northwest of them that had been carved out of the Northwest Territory of having a fugitive slave clause, which created an obligation that if you came upon an obvious escaped slave, that you had the duty to return him to him or her to their master. It was always controversial until the Civil War.
But if you look at the actual language of the clause, they go out of their way to talk about states and slavery so as not to ever have anyone imply that the national government would condone slavery or participate in slavery.